You are mine, you belong to me. I am the man. I shall take you out on the night of the 18th of November.
Nigel Benn is talking to you.
He's all hype, you know, and I can't wait to November the 18th to give him a good hiding.
He's the real hype. I come up the hard way. I've been
proved myself, boy.
You had your time. Let's have some parliamentary procedure here, all right?
Sure.
But what makes you think you can beat Nigel Benn?
Because he's just a puncher.
It's time for the fighting. The champ!
Eubank Jr. vs. Benn, the family history. Hey fight fans, welcome to Round 1 Boxing. Be sure to give us a like and subscribe if you want more in-depth content about your favorite fighters. Today we will look at the rivalry and intergenerational beef that connects Chris Eubank, Nigel Benn, and their two sons. The two elders in their family trees don't need any introduction. But as we all know, Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn participated in one of the greatest British boxing rivalries ever. Their first fight was watched by over 10 million people on primetime television. Live figures we are unlikely to ever see again on terrestrial TV. Benn and Eubank's personalities clashed from the off. However, both fighters were world-class and will go down as legends at super middleweight. Benn's ferocious power and Eubank's granite chin were examples of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Given that Eubank is so flamboyant, he's a complete enigma. He is a warrior, a throwback fighter with exceptional ability. Nigel Benn was a raw and dangerous power puncher who was often at his most dangerous when he was hurt in a fight.
Punch his edge, he's not going to be able to strut, he's going to have to try and hurt Benn. He's done it! He's done Benn by the look of it. He chopped that right hand down those right.
The pre-fight press conferences and build-ups that Eubank and Benn immersed themselves in back in the early 90s. With such a blistering build-up and tenacious chemistry between the two, the first fight wouldn't disappoint. The first fight took place in Birmingham and was considered one of the most outstanding super middleweight titles of all time. Many writers voted it as the fight of the year. Eubank emerged victorious by stoppage after referee Richard Steele stopped the fight in round 9. Following his victory, Eubank went on to fight in multiple title fights, including a win that went down in the history books for all the wrong reasons. After stopping Michael Watson, the talented 26-year-old contender was rushed to the hospital and suffered severe brain damage, never to fight again. Rightly so, Eubank didn't appear to be the same ferocious entity he once was. 3 years had passed by when he stepped in against Nigel for the second fight. However, public interest in the fight had bubbled to almost incalculable proportions. The rematch occurred at Old Trafford Football Stadium in Manchester and was much tighter than the first fight. However, with the judges scoring it a draw after 12 hard-fought rounds and an estimated audience on TV of over 100 million, many people still debate the fight's outcome. For many British boxing fans, the Benn-Eubank rivalry is one of the greatest British boxing rivalries of all time. This is for many reasons. Not only were both fighters top legitimate contenders, but the fight, especially the first one, surpassed any prior expectations. When it comes to substantial money-spinning fights, they often look much better on paper than how they pan out. However, Benn Eubank was the exception to the rule. Following their retirement, Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn toned down their ferocity and later became friends. After performing at many after-dinner events, they've buried the hatchet and have cemented their legacy in British boxing forever. During the golden era of British boxing, Eubank and Benn became fathers. Chris Eubank had a son of the same name in 1989, and 7 years later, Nigel fathered Conor. Of course, with such famous fathers, the pair took completely different paths into the boxing world. Chris Eubank Sr. made his way through the tough gyms with no money, having to prove to promoter Barry Hearn that he had what it took to become a world champion. Nigel joined the army when he was 18 and later learned his trade at the West Ham Boxing Club in East London. He also had a demanding schooling in America, fighting all across the states to improve his overall game. Although the two elders on the Benn-Eubank saga have buried their hatchet, the words exchanged over the years have likely stuck with the two sons of the legendary champions. Chris Eubank Jr. is on record stating that he remembers Benn's words about his father in the lead-up to their fights. Such a fierce rivalry has stuck with fight fans for generations, and it can be easy to overlook its impact on the family and friends of the boxers involved in such vicious taunting. Many may pass it off as part and parcel of the fight game, but when lives are on the line and friends become enemies, it's often those closest to the fighters who pick up the pieces. Both Eubank Sr. and Benn know this all too well. Following Eubank's fight with Michael Watson and Nigel Benn's fight with Gerald McClellan, both have first-hand experience of how much damage one ill-fated battle can cause. Both of these fights played a significant role at the end of Eubank and Benn's careers. It was also a catalyst for them to tell their sons never to step in the ring. With Eubank Sr. and Nigel both making millions in the ring, there was no need for their sons to step in the ring and prove themselves. Eubank Jr. and Conor both attended private school and had an upbringing where they did not have to worry about cash. This has likely fueled the idea for both men to become professionals to prove that they have the same genes as their legendary fathers, but can also mix it with the best. Chris Eubank Jr. took the challenging route, and although asked by his father not to step foot in the boxing ring, Chris was eager to prove himself in the same trade as his legendary dad. He worked relentlessly in gyms and sparred hundreds of rounds against professionals to harness his skill set. Chris Jr. took his first boxing steps as an amateur in the States. He spent his formative years in the UK but moved to the States when he was 16. This is where he began to learn the meticulous craft of boxing. With the genes he was naturally gifted, Chris took to the sport quickly and racked up several wins as an amateur, including a Golden Gloves title in Nevada before turning professional with British promoter Mick Hennessy in 2011. Eubank rose steadily through the ranks and surprised a lot of experts and analysts who believed he was riding the curtails of his famous surname. He was dispatching decent fighters and compiling a solid knockout record. It was time for him to step up in opposition, and he did against former Olympian Billy Joe Saunders in his first attempt at winning a world championship belt. The fight was close, but many believe Saunders had done enough to win over the 12-round distance, and he was declared the eventual winner. Around the same time in a land down under, Conor Benn was learning the boxing basics in Australia. Eubank Jr. is 7 years older than Conor, so the early part of their careers understandably took a different path. However, there were still some similarities in the primitive stages of their boxing journeys. Even though great fights are out there to be made, there are very few, if any, with the backstory of Benn and Eubank, which spans across generations. Conor didn't have as much of an amateur background as Eubank Jr., although they both didn't hang around in the unpaid ranks for very long. However, both fighters were keen to get going in the paid ranks and prove themselves amongst the best in the division. Eubank Jr. got his hands on the IBO strap. Now, with the multitude of belts, super belts, international belts, and about 400 different variants of world titles, it can be challenging for fans to keep up with who owns the belts. The IBO doesn't quite cut it as one of the big three belts: WBC, WBA, and IBF. Eubank was handed the second career defeat by an aging George Groves, a former world champion who used his jab to bamboozle Eubank and take a clear points win. Although Eubank didn't quite show that he had what it took to mix it at the elite level, a young Conor Benn was making his way through the professional ranks around the same time after turning professional in 2016. With Eubank campaigning at super middleweight and Benn down at welterweight, although some interest was sparked, there needed to be more of a gap between the two for any serious talks about a fight. Eubank had proved himself at the world level. Although he had come up short, Benn still had much more to prove. He had a few doubters who believed he could make it at that level. Even if he did, at this point, he was still 3 weights below Eubank. Benn has looked impressive in his last few outings. After demolishing Samuel Vargas in 1 round, the boxing fraternity began to sit up and take notice. Vargas had taken one of the brightest prospects in the world, Virgil Ortiz Jr., 7 rounds. Benn walked through Vargas as if he wasn't even there. He then continued to fight at a solid level, gaining valuable experience in stopping Chris Algieri.
It's been a phenomenal rise. Oh, good 1-2 and he's down! Left-right combination.
Who had previously lasted 12 rounds with Manny Pacquiao. That being said, Algieri is in the twilight of his career, but Benn could only beat what is placed in front of him, and he did so emphatically. Once Eubank Jr. moved down to middleweight, the idea of a catchweight fight between the sons of two legends was on the cards. Despite the difference in weight, it isn't something that hasn't happened before. You only need to look at how the legendary Roberto Duran, a natural lightweight, was campaigning at middleweight and going 15 rounds with the likes of marvelous Marvin Hagler. We aren't saying Conor Benn is Roberto Duran. At first, a few eyebrows were raised at this fight. Given the weight advantage and difference in experience, it seemed like a hard sell. For somebody like Chris Eubank Jr., who had lasted 12 rounds with big punching super middleweights like George Groves, the idea of him facing a welterweight who hadn't fought anybody in the top 10 of his division was a stretch. Many experts believed the fight was announced at the wrong time and that the idea of fighting at a catchweight could damage both fighters. You only have to watch the Kell Brook vs. Gennady Golovkin fight to see how damaging it can be to a fighter who moves up to a weight that's too big for them.
I promise bringing big drama show like street fight. Look, this is not boxing, this is like street fight.
The same applies to Eubank. The fight was to take place at around 157 pounds. Eubank had never fought at such a low weight before and looked weight drained even at middleweight. Unfortunately, we never got to see Benn Eubank, given that Conor Benn tested positive for a banned drug called clomiphene. Eddie Hearn has been doing his best to promote Benn's innocence. However, Benn has been widely condemned and scalded by the boxing community, and it's doubtful his fights will create the same buzz again. Eubank opted to fight Liam Smith instead, a much better fight than Benn. Somebody proven at the world level with a durable chin and solid fundamentals. Although it was sold as a fairly even fight, many people on the inside chose Smith to win. Liam Smith didn't just win, he decimated Eubank. It was unusual to watch Eubank badly hurt and wobble. Bigger punches hadn't shaken him at higher weight classes, but Smith proved that the right punch in the right spot could hurt anybody. It wasn't just one either, it was at least 3 or 4 clean shots.
Really giving Smith too much of an opportunity to do his own work. This time though, let's go with the left hand. Eubank walk forward, and Liam Smith is on the brink. 2 minutes remaining.
Ben had buried the idea of a Eubank-Benn fight, but Smith put the nail in the coffin. It could be for the best that this grudge match didn't take place at a dangerous catchweight, and the legacy of the family name was preserved. Be sure to give us a like and subscribe if you have enjoyed this video. Spread the word about Round 1 boxing, and stay tuned for more vids.